Happy April Fool's Day. This is Geography 10, Lecture 14. There were a handful of slides at the end of the last lecture that I didn't get to, but I have incorporated them into this one. So we will cover them without having to go back to that slideshow. Today, I want to talk about capitalism and colonialism. I want to describe the scramble for Africa. I want to talk about uneven development. And then at the end, if we have a chance, I want to talk a little bit about the Orwell essay that you read for today, Shooting an Elephant. Here's the update as far as readings and such. For Tuesday, I'd like you to read Chapter 2 of Delaney, the Territory book. For next Thursday, another couple sections of the Bernstein essay from your reader. On Tuesday the 13th, this is a slight change from the syllabus. The syllabus says we would watch this movie Life and Debt on the 15th, Thursday, but we're going to have to move that up. So the movie Life and Debt will be shown in lecture on Tuesday the 13th. I will let you know next week what we're going to do on Thursday the 15th. As I said last time, there's a map quiz next week in sections on sub-Saharan Africa. The relevance of that should be obvious in terms of today's lecture. And then finally, one other note, research papers are due in lecture on April 13th. So you have another reason besides the movie to come to lecture on that day. Are there any questions? Okay. I want to start by picking up a couple of the key points from the last two lectures. We've been reading Max Weber and Karl Marx, trying to understand what capitalism is. For our purposes, the key points from those lectures, from Weber, the key point is that speculation is inherent in capitalism, both rational speculation, as he defined it, and irrational speculation. From Marx, I would like you to take away as your key points the idea that the key drivers and processes, the sort of internal dynamics of capitalism, are first money as capital, that is, money used in a particular way, rather than just money in and of itself. We'll talk about that more in a moment. And the commodification of labor and land, picking up a point that we've hit a number of times this semester already. And so keeping those key points in mind, the question for today is how do these relate to colonialism and capitalism, the relationship between colonialism and capitalism. So we're going to try to understand the relationship between what happened in Europe beginning in the late 18th and early 19th century, as that unfolded over the course of the 19th century, and we'll bring it up to about World War I today, and then skip ahead a little bit with Orwell. The things that happened elsewhere in the world, in places like Africa, how were they related to or driven by industrializing capitalism in Europe? This is a map depicting colonial dominion in the first half of the 18th century, so roughly 1700 to 1763. The patterns here are pretty striking. So we have England, France, Spain, and Portugal, and then, according to these, and also the Netherlands, which is barely visible here in and of itself. But the possessions that they had or claimed around the world, we see the French principally in what's now Canada and parts of the Mississippi Basin. We see, the French here principally, Louisiana, New France here, the British along the coast of what's now the United States, the Spanish in Mexico up into what's now California, down through Central America and much of the western half of South America. The Portuguese with Brazil here, also Mozambique, along the coast of what's now Angola. And we can see by the underlinings that these European powers also had smaller possessions in terms of territory scattered around Southeast Asia, along the coast of Africa. And then this map blows up the picture in the Caribbean, where the different powers had rather complicated patterns of territorial influence and control on the islands of the Caribbean, the West Indies. This area, as we've already seen, dominated by sugar production, sugar plantations at that time. I want you to notice that most of Africa here is labeled as undiscovered. It's not yet fallen under the control, at least in the interior, of these European powers. Keep this map in mind as we move forward and watch the ways in which it changes between 1700 and 1900. Any questions? Here's a similar map in 1900. What kinds of things do we see? The Spanish and the Portuguese have lost their control in Latin America. These countries have gained their independence and are no longer subservient politically to Spain and Portugal. We see that the United States has booted the British out, bought the French out. Canada is still part of the United Kingdom at this point in time, or the British Commonwealth, and to that extent is still part of an imperial or colonial framework, but it's gained its own very distinct territorial boundaries. We see that the interior of Africa and the islands of Southeast Asia, India, Australia, these areas have become colonies. They have gained interior territorial boundaries. They have taken up the shape that, for the most part, many of these boundaries remain today, although they are now independent countries. Ethiopia and Liberia are the only countries in Africa at this point that have their independence. We've seen a pretty radical reconfiguration. What was once undiscovered has been effectively brought within the colonial control of the European powers. Areas that had previously been colonies have gained their independence. There's a whole slew of now 15 different European and, in one case, Asian, so Japan is there, countries that claim control of other parts of the world beyond their boundaries. Anybody notice the one United States colony that's visible on this map? Yeah. The Philippines, right there, which that happened only shortly before this time period. Any questions about that? Yeah. Is Taiwan a Japanese possession at this time? It certainly appears that way, doesn't it? Yes. I don't know the details of that history, but I believe you're correct. Any other questions? So we're interested in understanding how this happened. I'm not going to talk about the independence struggles of the Spanish colonies in Latin America, although that belongs in this subject as well. We're more interested today primarily with what happened in Africa between 1700 and 1900. So let's go back to Marx and this idea of money as capital. Marx explicitly, emphatically says in Capital, Volume 1, that capital is not a thing. This is a hard thing to remember, but it's an important thing to remember. Capital, he says, is a process. So if you think for a moment that it's a pile of money that's about to be invested, yes, that's capital, but it's not the fact that it's money that makes it capital. It's the fact that it's about to be invested. It's what happens next. The process here depicted, you start with money, you convert it into commodities. That's what C stands for here. The commodities in question are of two kinds, in Marx's opinion: labor power and means of production. That's what LP and MP stand for. You put those together, you work your way through this process of production, in which you produce more commodities. You transform these into this. And the prime is to suggest that you have produced something more or new or different from what you had before. That you take back to the market and you sell for money, more money, if everything goes according to plan, than you started with. And then the process can repeat. So we're interested in thinking about how all the pieces come together to enable this process to happen. And obviously, this formula, or sort of conceptual configuration, does not speak to questions of space at all. Yes? Raw materials are included in means of production. For Marx, the key thing here is to differentiate the labor power because that's the source of new value. Means of production includes basically everything else. It includes the machinery, the land, the raw materials, everything you need to combine with the labor power to make production happen. Now, where do those means of production come from? Where are these labor powers, these laborers who have this labor power? What happens between here, where you buy the stuff that's going to go into production, and here, where you sell it? If you buy your means of production and your labor in one part of the world and sell the outcome at the end in another part of the world, what's happened in between? Obviously, these spatial questions are really important. How do you get the gold or the rubber or the sugar from where it's produced to where you need it, either for production or for sale? And how do those spatial configurations affect the overall working out of this formula? How does that contribute to making M prime bigger than M? These are some of the questions that we want to think about in thinking about colonialism. So this process depends on social relations being in important ways commodified. You have to bring the exchange value and the use value together in an object. Remember, that's Marx's definition of a commodity. It has both exchange value and use value. It includes, in this case, land and people. They, too, are commodified. They become things that have use value as well as exchange value. This does not necessarily mean that they're slaves, right? You can commodify a person's labor by hiring them and paying them a wage rather than simply by owning them. Slaves are a commodity as well, but they are not the only kind of way you can commodify labor. And Marx would argue that they're a rather primitive way of commodifying labor. You make the object into property. And here we might think about Delaney, right? The property as a key dimension of the way not only things but also space, land, the oceans, can be folded into these social relations. There also, incidentally, needs to be some kind of political framework that will acknowledge, recognize those property claims, and enforce them. You encompass these pieces, these processes, in market relations. You enable them to be bought and sold, exchanged for each other, which is quite an achievement if you think about it in terms of colonialism and international trade. The market relations for these goods have got to extend across national boundaries, across entire continents and oceans, and integrated into a market in which these price signals can operate. Now, these social relations, these commodified social relations, we might think of them not as somehow achieved once and for all and thereafter fixed and stable, but in fact, in themselves an ongoing sort of process of reproduction and change. It needs to, these social relations themselves have to be produced and reproduced if they are to persist. And in a lot of parts of the world, just putting those social relations in place is a struggle that lasts hundreds of years, or at least it has or can. Any questions? So how do we make sense of this? How do we explain it? This slide is from the last lecture, actually. The idea that you amass surplus wealth in money form and other paper representations. Once you have it amassed, you can invest it in production rather than simply in trade. It involves the development of technologies to increase the rates of production driven by competition between firms, or in this case, countries, and the amassing of laborers in a coordinated fashion with work dictated by the tools and machines that they employ rather than the other way around. These are all steps or components of this larger process of producing and reproducing, maintaining these social relations. Now, this is the part I was at last time at the end of lecture and didn't quite get to. Again, thinking about this spatially, thinking about it in terms of space and time, I said last time that innovation involves somehow increasing the rate of accumulation, the rate at which you turn m into m prime. And that this is a rate measured not just in terms of profit, but in terms of time. If you can complete the process more quickly, then you have gained a competitive advantage over your competitors. You can make goods more quickly. You can also circulate them more quickly. And I brought out from Marx the phrase annihilation of space by time, the idea that capitalism has driven the production of systems of distribution and communication that shrink the world, so to speak. They bring places closer together in the sense that they make it easier to get from one to the other, to move goods from one to the other, to move information and money from one to the other. You can overcome distance in this way, and this can facilitate that acceleration in the circulation of goods and therefore in the rate of capital accumulation. There are, so to speak, you can think of this in terms of internal and external strategies for achieving this, for achieving growth in the rate of production and surplus value accumulation. You can expand outwards to incorporate new parts of the world into your markets. And colonialism is obviously an instance of this. You can reach out and find new raw materials, new laborers, and also new markets in places that were previously beyond the reach of your markets or your productive systems. There's also an internal face to this process in which you can, so to speak, intensify production within the spaces where it already exists. You can develop new innovations, new industries. You can tear down old systems that no longer are very competitive and build new ones, taking advantage of new circumstances. You can essentially find and exploit differentials within the existing geographical framework rather than simply expanding outwards. And in this respect, the built environment becomes increasingly important. We want to think about the construction of built environments in places in Europe, the factories, the railroads, the boats and shipping systems that intensify the rate at which production occurs in those places and facilitate or depend on continued interaction with faraway places that provide raw materials and markets. Primitive accumulation we've talked about before, understanding this as the production of the conditions necessary for the process that is capital to play itself out, specifically focusing on issues of land and labor. Any questions? This term, combined development, applies to most of what we will be discussing today. It refers to development that combines capitalist social relations in one place, sometimes called core economies. And here we're thinking principally of industrial urban centers in Europe and later on in North America and other places, with other kinds of social relations that aren't yet commodified in another place. And these are frequently called peripheral. And it articulates these two together. And this is important because these other kinds of social relations, and the examples given here are kin-based or tributary, can persist for a long time, even in this articulated relationship with commodified social relations in the core economies. So if we think about African societies and economies in the 19th century, we can recognize that some of them were kin-based, in which the most important relations defining people and their relationships to each other, and in many ways defining how they worked as an economy, were relationships based on kinship. So it could be your clan. It could be your lineage. These were the anthropologists have studied this to their heart's content. There's an incredible diversity of them, but they can be grouped under the notion of kin-based economy, or a kin-based social system, the economy being incorporated into that. Tributary is a system in which the defining relations of the economy are those of tribute, basically, in which certain people pay tribute to other people, political leaders. They might be local or they might be further afield. But the relationship of domination is sort of strictly political, and the economy is incorporated into that. You haven't got a separate market that operates according to its own logic. You have a political system of domination in which certain people are simply in power, and they extract tribute from the people who produce it. Produce whatever it is. Food is typically the major one. Those systems, and again, they're very diverse, and they're sort of conveniently grouped under these headings, can actually produce surpluses that can then be fed into more commodified social relations in other parts of the world. So the extraction of rubber from the Belgian Congo, which we'll talk about shortly, is an example of this. The people in the Belgian Congo who actually went and got the rubber were not wage laborers. They were not being paid for their time. They were simply required, as a condition of their being there, to turn over a certain amount of rubber every month to the Belgian colonial officials. This was a kind of tribute, essentially. They were not technically slaves, because they were not themselves bought and sold as people. They did not belong as property to the Belgian officials. They simply had to produce a certain amount of rubber and hand it over as tribute. And that rubber went straight to Europe, where it was a commodity. But you can see that you have got an articulation between two very different sets of social relations in two very separated places. But these are extremely important, both for what happens in the Belgian Congo, and even what's still happening there today, and for what happens in Europe, courtesy of that rubber. Are there any questions? Bernstein defines imperialism as a general system of domination by a state or states of other states, regions, or the whole world. Thus, political subjugation through colonialism is only one form this domination might take. Imperialism also encompasses different kinds of indirect control. That map from 1900 depicts colonialism, which, if you recall, involves the direct political subjugation of an outside external territory. But imperialism is a broader category and does not require colonialism, although it can accompany it, and in the cases we're going to talk about today, does accompany it. But we are going to watch those sort of process of transformation as colonialism and imperialism kind of work out their different forms and relationships with each other over the course of more than a century. Other people have also written extensively about imperialism, one of them being Lenin in 1916, so not long before the completion of the Russian Revolution. He wrote a famous book about imperialism, and he made the argument that it was driven by two complementary needs. The need on the one side to find sources of raw materials and markets for European manufactured goods in ever-increasing volumes. So here we might think about the stuff, basically. Where do the raw materials come from, and where do those goods that you produce go? In order for that process to work itself out between M and C prime and M prime, you need to have a constant influx of raw materials, and you have to have a place where, at the end of the day, you can sell those commodities and get M prime out of it. And the nature, if you think about this, if this is a system that is constantly trying to do this, if all the production in a place like the United Kingdom is aimed towards doing this over and over and over again, it has to expand. It has to get bigger. There has to be more M prime all the time, which is going to mean more C, which is going to mean more means of production and more labor power. That expansion has to happen from somewhere and to somewhere. And this first point is about that. But Lenin also drew attention to the need to find investment opportunities that would be more profitable than those available in Europe itself. And again, think back to that process. You start with M, you end with M prime. If it works, you will constantly find yourself with more money than you started with. And the point will always be to plow that money back into the process again, to invest it somewhere. What do you do if there's no place to invest? You look around and there are all the factories you need for the current market. There's no need to make more, given the current market. You need to find some place to send that money where it can complete this process, this ever-repeating process. And this, Lenin suggests, is the other driving force behind imperialism. You could imagine it as a response to a surplus of money capital in the core economies, moving outward in search of investment opportunities. Any questions? Yeah. We're going to talk about rubber in the Belgian Congo in a second. So I'll answer that question then. Okay? So, the scramble for Africa. Which is dated here as 1884 to 1914. 1884 being the date of the Berlin Conference, which I'll discuss in a moment. 1914 being, of course, the beginning of World War I. This was a period of intense geopolitical and financial tumult, crisis, wrangling, in which the countries of Europe, the developed industrial powers of Europe, principally the United Kingdom and France, but Germany, Portugal, others also involved, scrambled to get as much as they could of Africa. They imposed territorial definition and foreign rule across virtually the entire continent. So this is when those lines get drawn from the coast inwards until all of Africa has been divided up. It is driven and closely related to European industrialism. It was very much about finding and controlling natural resources and labor power and incorporating them into the various industrial growth machines of Europe. And in many ways, it's a prelude to World War I and the rise of totalitarianism. It anticipates and shapes, informs much of what happens in Europe that produces World War I and, in fact, later produces World War II. So this is a very important 30-year period of time that takes place in Africa, in Europe as well, obviously, but which brings about the circumstances that would strongly affect Europe in the 20th century. So here we have 1914. By the end of this period, you have 7 different European powers: Belgium, France, Germany, Great Britain, Italy, Portugal, and Spain. And they have divided up Africa into what we would now call countries. These were colonies. The boundaries of these colonies are very, very similar to the boundaries we now recognize as the boundaries of African nation-states. You see that the UK and France are the biggest winners, so to speak. The United Kingdom controlling a large amount of land in south-central Africa, and then again along the Nile River, as well as Nigeria and other parts of West Africa. The French controlling most of northwest Africa. The Germans here, the Belgians here, Germans over here as well. The Portuguese in Angola and Mozambique and Madagascar. What have we left out? The Italians in Libya, Eritrea, parts of Somaliland. So how did this happen? How did these lines get drawn and these occupying powers assert themselves? Why was it not still a case in which they could just have little ports or smaller colonies and leave this interior alone? What was motivating them to insist somehow on the entirety of the continent in a territorial form of this nature with these boundaries? And it starts, well, it doesn't start. It reaches ahead at the Berlin Conference of 1884 to 1885. And we have the list of participants here, basically all of the important powers of Europe, along with the U.S. and Zanzibar. Zanzibar being a rather powerful and well-organized state of sorts on the east coast of Africa. It had long had very important trade relations between Africa and South Asia, and at this point was still enough of a power to earn a seat at the table. It produced the General Act of the Berlin Conference, which is more frequently known as the Congo Act. The Berlin Conference was called principally at the behest of King Leopold of Belgium. And King Leopold Well, I'll talk about him in a moment. So what did the Congo Act say? So they met through the winter, and they produced this act, and they signed off on it in 1885. It made the Congo, which for a period of time was later known as Zaire, into the property of the Belgian crown. King Leopold, shall we put it, was jealous. He was rich and powerful, but he was envious of the wealth and power of the British and the French and even the Spanish and the Portuguese. He wanted a piece of the action. He wanted the Congo. And he got the rest of the European powers to agree that it belonged to him. And this is an important distinction. He didn't get them to agree that the Congo was a colony of the Belgian state. He got them to agree that the Congo was the property of the Belgian crown, which was him. It was his personal property. It was organized as the Congo Society. We'll talk about that in a moment. But it was his personal property. How did he do this? Believe it or not, he did it by fashioning himself as a progressive, free-thinking, open-minded man, an enlightened man. He stood up and insisted on two principles: free trade and the end of slavery. And in this way, he aligned himself in powerful ways with the British, who had abolished slavery 70 years before, almost 80 years before. And he aligned himself with progressive advocates for the end of slavery everywhere else in the world. It had only recently ended, and he was for most of the European powers, and he was taking advantage of the idea that this was a progressive thing to do. He said, there will not be slavery in the Congo. He said there will also be free trade, which was something the British particularly advocated. Even back then, it was the thing you advocated if you were a modern industrial power. You wanted free trade. One of the big bones of contention among the European powers at this time was precisely that trade was not free in most parts of the world for most goods. Part of the logic of the colonial empires was that you had privileged trade status within your colonial holdings, and you were working in rivalry against the other colonial empires, and there were stiff tariffs and restrictions imposed on trade between the different empires. Right? So the British wanted their colonies in Africa and elsewhere in the world to produce goods that they could freely get but other people couldn't. And they would feed them into their factories and produce manufactured goods and then send them back out with free or very reduced tariffs. Whereas if the French or the Italians or the Portuguese or the Germans wanted to sell their goods, the British would impose stiff tariffs on those goods, not only at home but also in their colonies. There were essentially trade wars going on between the empires, and they were intended to protect your own factories, your own industries, against rivals from the outside, but they had the effect of inhibiting trade. And the British, as the most powerful of these players at the table, wanted there to be more free trade and didn't like the tariffs that other countries put up and liked to think of itself as being more free-thinking, open-minded, sort of advocates of an Adam Smith invisible hand kind of approach to the economy. So Leopold said, there will be free trade in the Congo Basin. The Congo will belong to me, but I will not impose tariffs on the goods of other countries. I will let the Congo be a realm in which free trade occurs. And I will even go so far as to open the shipping on the Congo and Niger rivers to my competitors, to other countries, to ships sailing under the flags of other empires. This was also he also got them to agree to an international prohibition on the slave trade, which effectively brings an end to it. And then finally, at the bottom here, this one is extremely important. The principle of effectivity. They all agreed that if you were going to claim possession of a foreign land, a colony, you couldn't just do it on the map and enforce it with naval brigades on the coastlines. You actually had to go occupy and control and defend those lands. You had to draw lines on the map and show an effective presence there in order to claim them. And this is what drives the scramble for Africa, perhaps more than anything else. It was kind of a starting gun to a race in which everyone was going to go try to get as much territory as they could, as quickly as they could, because you may have made a claim to something on a map, but you don't really get it unless you go possess it, effectively control it. Any questions? Here's King Leopold II of Belgium. If you're interested in learning more about this, there's a fantastic book called King Leopold's Ghost, which tells this story in all of its detail. King Leopold II, an extremely vain and dreadful man, perhaps the 19th century's most extraordinary criminal. Nonetheless, he was king, and he got away with it. David Livingstone, Henry Morton Stanley. These are two Brits, famous explorers in Africa. There's a famous story about Stanley spending years wandering around the interior of Africa looking for Livingstone, right? And he finally finds him. And apparently, according to legend, he looked at him and said, "Dr. Livingstone, I presume." Right? This classic British, manners reappearing in the middle of Africa. Stanley was hired by Leopold to go to the Congo, which was in large measure still unexplored by Europeans, and carry out a plan. It started in 1876 when Leopold organized the International African Association, again under various progressive-sounding banners of freedom and opposition to slavery. He changed the name to the International Congo Society in 1878. He hired Stanley for 5 years to travel around the Congo Basin. He was one of very few Europeans who had any idea where to, what was there or how to get around, and signed treaties with the local peoples with this International Congo Society. Eventually, he had treaties covering more than 900,000 square miles. And this was the sort of coalition or consortium or political entity that Leopold then converted into this Congo Free State, which persisted from 1885 to 1908, when actually the Belgian government finally stripped him of personal possession of the Congo. So Congo Free State makes it sound like a state. It, in fact, was a kind of plaything for Leopold. If you look at the map, this is dated, obviously. It still calls it Zaire, an enormous country on the equator in the middle of Africa. The Congo River here defines this area in important ways. One of the reasons the area had been so little explored is that the river, although it is enormous, in terms of volume, it's the second largest river in the world. Getting from the ocean to the interior on the river was basically impossible. The river flows through a series of canyons here, And in places, they've recently discovered, it's more than 750 feet deep. It's the world's deepest river. Once you got past those canyons and waterfalls, it opens up into an enormous lake along the river. And this is where Kinshasa is located and Brazzaville on the other side. And from here, up the river, all the way to, where's Kisangani? Somewhere in here, it's actually quite navigable. You can move big boats fairly easily along it. There are waterfalls here and there, but compared to this, it's nothing. And one of the early achievements of the Congo Free State was to force the locals to build a railway from the ocean up to Kinshasa, which of course got named Leopoldville, so that there would be some kind of way of connecting for purposes of trade between the ocean and the rest of the interior here. The first and most dramatic and outrageous of the many outrageous things that happened under Leopold's ownership of the Congo was the rubber boom. In 1890, the Dunlop company began making inflatable rubber tires. This was triggered by the discovery of a way to make rubber resilient, essentially, to make it the vulcanization process such that it didn't dry out and become brittle eventually. You could blow it up into tires and they would last. And this triggered a huge worldwide boom in the production of things made of rubber, including tires, gaskets, electrical insulation, hoses, tubing, and so forth. Suddenly, you had a new material that could do a lot of things better than any previously known material could do it. But rubber at this time had to be collected directly from plants growing in tropical rainforests. The Belgian Congo, under Leopold's rule, set about to do this on an enormous scale. The rainforests of Congo are the second largest in the world, and there was a lot of rubber there. And they had set up a tributary system in which they could gather raw rubber from the forests for 1.35 francs per kilo, take them to Antwerp, and sell them for 10 francs a kilo, and make an extraordinary amount of money. And in a period of 14 years, the production and earnings from the rubber in the Congo increased 96-fold. How do you do this? The rubber actually grows in these vines that climb up into the canopy of the forest. The Belgians established a quota, 3 to 4 kilos of dried rubber per adult male villager per fortnight. Collecting this much rubber would require roughly 24 days per month of labor. So every male villager was required to simply go get this and turn it in. And that requires that you cut the vines and let the sap drip out and collect the sap. You have to work it and let it dry out until it forms into these. You can make these balls that are kind of sticky but stable. And you had to turn over this much every month. Or fortnight, I'm sorry. Fortnight should mean every 2 weeks, right? Yes? Do they still do this? There have been industrial processes developed to produce rubber. So the need to tap vines to get the raw material of rubber is now a minor part of the overall market. Pardon? Were they paid for this? No. Now, if you found a job doing this today in most of the parts of the world, I imagine you would get paid, but not very much. There was a corresponding boom going on in the Amazon at the same time, actually, in which other colonial powers were trying to figure out how to extract rubber from the Amazon. Now, there are a couple of things to notice about this system. You set this up. One thing is, of course, 24 days a month is pretty much full-time work, right? So you're not going to have time to do very much of anything else, such as hunt or grow food or hang out with your family. This was an extraordinarily exploitative requirement to make. And surprise, surprise, most of the villagers didn't really like this. And they were intensely interested in getting away from it. Yes? Can they get to the water? With rubber production? I have no idea what kinds of impacts this might have had on water. The village people no doubt needed water. I don't believe there was much in the way of byproducts that would contaminate water from this process, but I honestly don't know. So it became necessary to somehow enforce this quota. And this was not easy to do. Next thing to notice. Like this one, it's pretty easy, right? This is pretty close to ground level. You just sort of tap this, and you can let it drip and come back later and collect it. But as the sources at ground level got used up, more and more you had to climb into the canopy of the treetops to get to vines that you could tap. If you tap the trees or the vines poorly, if you cut too deeply, you will kill them. So there was another problem. In the scramble or rush to fulfill quotas, people might get in a hurry and overdo it, and the supply. I mean, if you do this, if you do this right, and you don't try to take too much, it can be a sort of ongoing annual extraction from each plant. But if you start to kill them, you're going to see it's going to get harder and harder. You're going to have to go further and further, and you're going to have to climb higher and higher up into these trees. And there started to be a significant amount of injuries associated with people falling out of the treetops in their effort to get this. But it gets worse. In order to get the male villagers to fill their quotas, the colonial officials, acting through native conscripts, they drafted a certain number of native Belgian Congolese into the Belgian army and sent them out to enforce the quota. So this was actually, in most cases, being done by Africans as far as enforcement under the whips, literally, of the Belgian military colonial officials. They found that in order to enforce the quotas, it was necessary to take hostage their families, to take their wives and children hostage and not give them back until the quota was fulfilled. This was necessary because otherwise these guys might disappear into the forest to collect their rubber and simply not come back. Their families could move with them. They might just basically flee. The soldiers who were charged with enforcing this were given guns and ammunition. But the military, the Congolese colonial officials discovered that these soldiers were hard to trust as well. And they would take their guns and their ammunition and they would go hunting because they had families to feed too. Ammunition was expensive, and the ammunition they were given was, in their view, more valuable for hunting wildlife to help feed their families than it was for shooting other Africans in the process of trying to enforce these quotas. And so the colonial officials came up with a plan, a way of dealing with this, and that was that they strictly counted the bullets, the ammunition that they gave to the conscripts. And they wanted to make sure that these bullets weren't being used, if at all, to enforce the quotas. And as a result, they said, for every bullet you use, we need some kind of token or proof that you, in fact, used it on a person and not on wildlife. Yes? If they kill the man, what happens to the children and wife? Good question. I mean, this is the ugliest story I'm aware of from African colonialism. What happened was that they required hands. If you were in the military, in the army, and you came in and said, I need more ammunition, you had to produce a human hand for every bullet that you had used to demonstrate that you had in fact used it for the intended purpose. And you started, this was actually unearthed and exposed largely by the work of black American missionaries who went to the Belgian Congo and worked in these areas and started to meet more and more African men who were missing hands. And the reason the soldiers were doing this is that they actually discovered that they still wanted to use the bullets for hunting wildlife, but they could hack off somebody's hand and get more bullets. By the time Leopold was stripped of his ownership of the Belgian Congo, by the best estimates, the population, the native population of the Congo had been diminished by 50%. And this is not just from direct beatings and shootings associated with rubber boom. This is also associated with forced labor to build railroads, all kinds of other activities associated with this colony. But again, actually the story is quite remarkable because much of the news of this when it came out was coming from American missionaries and the American black press and church press in the United States, exposing these stories to the media in the US. It would get to Europe, and then there were all kinds of inquiries, right? There were special commissions formed to investigate this and see whether it was true. And Leopold managed to contain the story for a long, long time and deny that it was happening and insist that it was false and that it was a bunch of propaganda being perpetrated by his enemies and that sort of thing. But it was essentially the sort of conscience of the world was eventually awakened to this through the work of American missionaries and other missionaries, many of them African or of African descent, working through networks from the U.S. to the United Kingdom and then to Europe. And this, eventually was reined in, but it took a great deal longer than it should have. We can take a 5-minute break. We haven't got much time left for the rest of these slides, so we're going to go a little quickly here. Just to quickly sort of bring this up to the present, this is a map depicting the mineral resources of what's now the Democratic Republic of Congo, although it's scarcely a republic and scarcely democratic. So tin, gold, coal, copper, what else? There are a lot of things. Manganese, diamonds, oil, iron ore, bauxite. There is an incredible wealth of minerals in addition to the rainforest in Congo. And as you can see, much of it is concentrated in the extreme eastern edge of the country. You can read about this in the news today if you want. In many ways, the sort of mayhem and chaos continues up to the present, not in the form of the cutting off of hands, perhaps, I hope, but in fact, in many ways, arguably even more disgusting, at least at certain moments. This is a total free-for-all zone right now. Militias and violence of all kinds. It crops up in the New York Times periodically. I believe, 3 million people dead in the last 10 years or something like that. Estimated. Of course, nobody really knows for sure. It just came up again just recently. Anyway, the legacy that King Leopold's Ghost, this book that I referred you to, I mean, one of the things that he wishes to document and establish is precisely this question of how many people died. And it's not an easy question to answer. And his estimate of half the population by 1908 is an estimate, but when he says King Leopold's Ghost, in many ways what he's talking about is the ghost of that mortality, the ghost of the decimation of the population, and the ways in which that crippled the country, crippled the area, crippled the people of the area for generations to come. And this is, in fact, one of the legacies that we're trying to think about here when we think about colonialism and its effects on the 20th century. In any case, the legacy of corruption, extraordinary exploitation of people and resources, feeding into the hands of a very small number of people. If you're familiar with Mobutu, this happened after independence as well as under colonialism, and in many ways is still happening to this day. So, change from the Belgians to the British. The British, of course, were much more powerful than the Belgians. They were the most powerful imperial power in 1885. And this was built on things that had already happened by that point in time, and one of the key arenas for this was Egypt. We've talked about the Suez Canal, and I've mentioned this before. The British took over the Suez Canal shares from Egypt in 1875. In other words, they bailed out the Egyptian government financially. They took on the debt that the Egyptian government had acquired in an effort to build the Suez Canal. Britain and France, sort of struggling under the load of the debt associated with the Suez Canal, took over financial control of Egypt in 1879, basically said, we're going to do the books so that we can make sure that we can get from you the payments that you owe us on this debt. This was an exploitative relationship. The Egyptians didn't take kindly to it, and they rose up in revolt in 1882, and the British military came in and crushed the revolts and took possession of the country and remained in power until the 1950s. They were primarily concerned in this to secure the shipping route to India through the Suez Canal. That was what they cared about. Because of their control of India and the massive amounts of trade that they were conducting between Asia and Europe, the Suez Canal was extraordinarily valuable to them, and they were not going to put up with any situation that would interrupt their ability to ship through it. Meanwhile, at the other end of the continent in South Africa, They fought a series of wars, the First and Second Boer Wars, against the descendants of the earlier Dutch colonists there, largely motivated here by diamonds and gold, which were extraordinarily abundant. And they won these wars and took over control of South Africa. Here we see industry and mining mineral resources in South Africa, again, extraordinarily rich in a variety of raw materials, minerals, especially diamonds and gold, but not only diamonds and gold. The British and the French had a kind of, were on a collision course. The French had a sphere of influence or control that extended east and west across the northern part of Africa and was almost complete. The British, meanwhile, had control in a sort of north-south corridor from South Africa to the Nile and on to Egypt, and they had visions of a gigantic railway that would unify the entirety of Africa and allow them to move goods very easily north and south from the Cape to Cairo. And in 1898, these two lines crossed. And of course, you can't have both of them satisfied. You can't run a line north-south and a line east-west and not have them cross. And they very nearly went to war over this. And in some ways, you could see this as a kind of preliminary skirmish that would be followed by, 15 years later, by World War I. Obviously, in that case, the British and the French were not at odds with each other. But in many ways, this was an anticipation of the kinds of conflicts that were brewing. Now, I want to talk briefly about what was learned in the British colonies in Africa and how it informed things that happened later. And this is an argument made by Hannah Arendt in a book called The Origins of Totalitarianism. She makes the case that Egypt provided the British with a kind of pilot or test case, a challenge which they resolved or they solved through the development of colonial bureaucracy. That there was a necessity to organize and run a very large, complicated country and to do it within the strictures of a government bureaucracy to protect their financial interests. Meanwhile, in South Africa, developed a political ideology of race and racism that was fomented in part by the Dutch and their extremely racist views towards the natives when they were in control down there, but which eventually issues into apartheid. And that Arendt's argument is that these two things, a bureaucratic system of organizing production for profit, and on the other end of the continent, a political apparatus that mobilized race as an ideology of rule. And she points out that in some cases, the pursuit of racism or the defense of racism in South Africa sometimes trumped profitableness itself. But that these two came together and informed British colonial practice elsewhere, and that they are both, in fact, necessary components of Nazism and Stalinism. That figuring out how to make bureaucracy and racism work together was, in a sense, what set the template for the rise of fascism in Europe. And we might come back to this when we talk about Orwell. So what's the outcome of all of this? Skipping ahead, glossing over God knows how many details from other parts of the continent. This table is taken from a Mike Davis book. The source is an economic study charting the shares of world gross domestic product from 1700 to 1952 between China, India, and Europe. And you see that in 1700 they had roughly equal shares of world production. 1820, China, in fact, was bigger than Europe in its overall production. By 1890, Europe had 2/5 of world production and dwarfed China and India. And by 1952, China and India had been reduced even further to mere fractions of what had been the case 250 years later. The only reason this number is smaller than this number, of course, is because of the rise of the United States. You can also look at it in terms of world manufacturing output from 1750 to 1900, and a similar pattern emerges. Europe in 1750 having a little less than 1/4 of world manufacturing. The tropics, in fact, having 3/4 of it. China nearly 1/3 all by itself. And by 1900, Europe has 63%. China just 6%. India less than 2%. The tropics as a whole 13.4%. This is not to say that somehow the factories were lifted out of China and moved to Europe. It's to say that the growth of manufacturing in Europe was extraordinary, and the existing manufacturing capacity of places like India and China were reduced. They were driven under, sometimes by economic means, sometimes by political or military means. In any case, this is the sort of end result of this process of colonial imperial domination. Now, the question came up, sort of, what about the wives and kids? What about the people? What about, this is in some ways the human expression of this, right? The loss of half the population of the Congo, what does that do? What kind of lasting effect could that have, would that have? There are other less extreme but similar directions, changes that you can document from other parts of the world. Mass mortality associated with famine, that kind of thing, not to mention wars. This is one possible way of thinking about this in the long run. Even 100 years later, the prevalence of stunted children could be interpreted as a legacy of the activities associated with this period of time. So, we don't have much time left. We'll get as far as we can here. So, what we have now is, by various, there are a bunch of ways of depicting it, illustrating it, dramatic unevenness in the development of different parts of the world. This is what uneven development is intended to convey or signify. A systematic process of economic and social development that is uneven in space and time and endemic to capitalism. This is not Adam Smith. This is Neil Smith, writing in the Dictionary of Human Geography, 4th edition. This is perhaps one of the core concepts that modern geography has to offer you. The idea that development is uneven and that the driver of that unevenness is principally capitalism. Now, the examples of colonial empire are extreme and are global in scale. But this unevenness should not be thought of simply as a difference between the North and the South. Here are some ways of depicting this. The unevenness in national income. You can see that most of Africa is at the very low end of the scale. There are other scales at which this also can be understood. Think about uneven development not only between the first and third worlds or the global North and South, but within nations, between nations and within nations. Industrial versus agricultural areas, cities and countries, prosperous and stagnant regions. You can think about it at the scale of cities as well, or urban metropolitan areas, business centers, residential, industrial zones, inner cities versus suburbs. Basically, everywhere you look, you can find examples of this unevenness. And that is, it may sound banal, it may sound so ubiquitous as to be almost unenlightening, but if you really think hard about the distribution of power and wealth in space, the way it manifests in the built environments and distribution of people, this unevenness really screams out for some kind of explanation. It's everywhere. How do we make sense of it? Why is it uneven? An environmental determinist would say it's uneven because of nature. There are just certain parts of the world that have got better soils, better water, better climate, you name it, that were just put there by natural processes and make certain places better for producing goods than others, and therefore wealthier. This obviously doesn't make much sense, because if you look, for example, at the distribution of energy consumption, you will see very quickly that the energy is not consumed where nature put it. Most of it is consumed in places like the United States that are far away from where most of it resides in the ground in the form of oil. Okay? So that's obviously inadequate. We can think about it in terms of social processes. Trade, moving those goods from where they were left by nature or put by nature to other places and blurring the unevenness. People building built environments that facilitate that movement until you get to a point where this built environment is, so to speak, a second nature that is produced and that is more important than the natural distribution that preceded. All right, I will stop there, and we will see you next week. Thanks a lot.